Standing at the altar in $50,000 worth of silk and diamonds, Alessandra Romano watched her world collapse in real time. Marco De Luca, Chicago's most feared crime lord, looked her in the eyes before every major family in the underworld and said the words that would destroy her. "I will not take this woman as my wife." Public rejection, political annihilation, total humiliation. But 3 months later, when war came for her family, the only man who could save her was the one who had shattered her. And this time, he had a confession that would change everything. Stay until the end to see how this story unfolds. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Cathedral of St. Augustine had never looked more beautiful or more treacherous. Alessandra Romano stood in the vestibule, her hands trembling beneath the cascading lace of her veil. 22 years old, raised in silk and secrecy, trained from childhood to understand that marriage in their world was never about love. It was about alliances, power, the delicate chess game played between families who ruled Chicago's underworld from the shadows. Her dress had cost more than most people earned in a year. White silk that flowed like water, hand-embroidered with pearls that caught the light with every breath. Her mother had wept when she'd first seen it, not from joy but from relief. Relief that her daughter would finally secure the family's position, that the Romano name would be tied to the most powerful syndicate in the city. Through the heavy wooden doors, Alessandra could hear the murmur of 300 guests. Every major family, every power player. The Russos, the Vitales, the Cartellis, all of them gathered to witness what should have been the consolidation of two empires. "You look perfect, Piccola," her father whispered, his weathered hand squeezing hers. Dante Romano had built his organization from nothing, clawed his way from the streets to the penthouse, and this marriage was supposed to be his crowning achievement. "The De Lucas will be fortunate to have you." Alessandra wanted to tell him that she didn't feel fortunate, that her stomach had been in knots for weeks, that every time she'd met with Marco De Luca during their brief, formal courtship, she'd seen something in his dark eyes that terrified her. Not cruelty, but emptiness. A man who had locked every human emotion behind walls so high that nothing could reach him. But she said nothing. In their world, daughters didn't voice doubts. They fulfilled duties. The music began. Pachelbel's canon, traditional and expected. The doors opened, and Alessandra took her first step down the aisle on her father's arm. The cathedral was a masterpiece of old-world grandeur. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, stained glass windows filtered colored light across the assembled crowd, and white roses, thousands of them, perfumed the air with a scent so heavy it was almost suffocating. Alessandra's eyes found Marco immediately. He stood at the altar in a black tuxedo tailored to perfection, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. 37 years old, with the kind of presence that made rooms fall silent when he entered them. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face all sharp angles and harder edges. Handsome in the way a blade was handsome, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Their eyes met as she approached, and for just a moment Alessandra thought she saw something flicker in his gaze. Something almost like regret. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar, impenetrable ice. She reached the altar. Her father lifted her veil, kissed her forehead, and placed her hand in Marco's. His palm was warm, his grip firm, and Alessandra felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Father Michael began the ceremony. The words washed over her in a blur. Duty, honor, union. All the pretty language that disguised what this really was. A business transaction. Her bloodline for his protection. Her family's struggling territory for his empire's strength. "If anyone has objections to this union," Father Michael intoned, his voice echoing through the cathedral, "speak now or forever hold your peace." It was a formality. No one ever objected. No one would dare. But then Marco's hand tightened around hers. Not in reassurance, but in warning. "I object." The words came from Marco himself. The cathedral went deathly silent. Alessandra felt the world tilt sideways, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that held only Marco's face. He was looking at her, but his expression was carved from stone, revealing nothing. "Marco?" Father Michael's confusion was evident. "What?" I will not take this woman as my wife. The words hit Alessandra like a physical blow. Around them, the assembled families erupted in shocked whispers, the sound building like a wave. She heard her mother's sharp gasp, her father's growled curse, but all of it seemed to come from very far away. Marco released her hand. This marriage will not proceed, he continued, his voice carrying across the cathedral with absolute authority. The agreement between the Romano and De Luca families is hereby dissolved. He turned to address the crowd, and Alessandra saw it then, the calculated coldness in every line of his body. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't doubt. This was deliberate destruction, executed with the same precision he brought to everything else. I appreciate the families who have gathered here today, Marco said, his tone formal, businesslike, as if he were conducting a board meeting rather than demolating a woman's life in front of 300 witnesses. But I have reconsidered this alliance and found it unsuitable for my purposes. Unsuitable. The word carved itself into Alessandra's chest. Not unworthy. Not problematic. Unsuitable. As if she were a piece of furniture that didn't match his decor. She stood frozen in her wedding dress, veil still pinned in her dark hair, makeup perfect, diamonds glittering at her throat, a bride without a groom, a woman publicly rejected at the moment of her greatest vulnerability. The whispers grew louder. She could feel every eye in the cathedral on her, could feel the weight of their pity, their curiosity, their barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing a Romano humiliation. Her father was already moving, his face purple with rage. De Luca, you bastardo! Mr. Romano, Marco's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. I suggest you accept this with grace. The alternative would be, unfortunate for everyone involved. It was a threat delivered with perfect civility, and everyone in the cathedral understood it. Marco De Luca controlled half of Chicago. He could destroy the Romano family with a phone call. This rejection was bad enough. Open warfare would be annihilation. Dante Romano stopped, his fists clenched, his breathing ragged. You have made an enemy today, De Luca. I have made a choice, Marco corrected. Nothing more. He turned back to Alessandra, and for just a second, so brief she almost missed it, something cracked in his expression, something that looked almost like pain. Then it was gone. I apologize for the inconvenience, Miss Romano, he said, and there was nothing in his voice now. Nothing at all. I hope you understand this is not personal. Not personal. The man had just obliterated her in front of every power player in Chicago, had branded her as unwanted, as unsuitable, as the woman even Marco De Luca wouldn't marry, and he claimed it wasn't personal? Something inside Alessandra snapped. She had been raised to be quiet, obedient, the perfect daughter who never made waves, who never questioned, who accepted her role with grace. But standing there in her wedding dress, drowning in humiliation while 300 people watched her world burn, Alessandra discovered she was capable of something she'd never felt before. Rage. Pure, white-hot, clarifying rage. Not personal? Her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the whispers. You reject me at the altar, in front of everyone who matters in our world, destroy my family's reputation and political standing with a few words, and you claim it's not personal? Marco's jaw tightened. Miss Romano, no. She stepped closer to him, ignoring the collective intake of breath from the assembled families. No one spoke to Marco De Luca like this. No one dared. You owe me more than corporate platitudes. If you're going to destroy me, at least have the courage to tell me why. For a long moment, they stared at each other. The cathedral had gone silent again, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see if Marco would put this upstart girl in her place. Instead, something shifted in his expression, something almost like respect. You want the truth? His voice was low, meant only for her, but in the echoing space, everyone heard it anyway. I refuse to marry you because caring about you would make me weak. In my world, weakness is death. I've seen what happens to men who let their hearts overrule their heads. I've buried them. I won't make that mistake. Alessandra felt her breath catch. Of all the explanations she'd expected, another woman, a better alliance, simple cruelty, she'd never anticipated this. He was refusing to marry her because he cared. So you destroy us both instead? She heard her voice shake and hated it. You think pushing away anything good makes you strong? It doesn't, Marco. It makes you hollow. It makes you exactly what your enemies want you to be. A man with nothing to lose, which means nothing to live for. His expression hardened again, walls slamming back into place. That's where you're wrong, Miss Romano. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous kind of man, and I intend to stay dangerous. Then I hope it keeps you warm, Alessandra said quietly, because you're going to be very alone. She turned, lifting her dress to keep from tripping over the train, and walked back down the aisle. Not running, not fleeing, walking with her head high, her spine straight, even as tears threatened to spill over and ruin the makeup that had taken 2 hours to apply. Behind her, she heard her father's furious voice, her mother's sobs, the explosion of conversation as 300 guests tried to process what they'd just witnessed. But Alessandra kept walking, through the vestibule, out the cathedral doors, into the bright Chicago afternoon where a line of town cars waited to transport the wedding party to a reception that would never happen. Her maid of honor, Gianna, rushed after her. "Alessa, I'm so sorry, Don't." Alessandra's voice cracked. "Please, just don't." She climbed into the nearest car, not the white Rolls-Royce decorated with ribbons that was meant to carry the bride and groom, but one of the black sedans meant for family, and told the driver to take her home. As the car pulled away from the cathedral, Alessandra caught a glimpse of Marco in the side mirror. He stood on the steps, surrounded by his men, his face once again that perfect mask of indifference. She wondered if he felt anything at all, or if he'd locked away his humanity so thoroughly that he couldn't feel even his own destruction. The Romano estate sprawled across 10 acres in Kenilworth, one of Chicago's most exclusive suburbs. Alessandra had grown up here, had played in these gardens as a child, had learned her family's business in the wood-paneled study, had been told 1,000 times that she was fortunate, privileged, destined for great things. Now she stood in her childhood bedroom, still wearing her wedding dress, and wondered how privilege could feel so much like a cage. Gianna helped her out of the gown, carefully hanging it in the closet, where it would serve as a monument to her humiliation. The makeup came off. The hairpins were removed one by one. The diamonds were returned to their velvet boxes. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror, Alessandra barely recognized the woman staring back. Same dark eyes, same olive skin, same delicate features. But something fundamental had changed. She looked older, harder, wounded. "Your father wants to see you," Gianna said quietly. "He's in his study with the Russos and the Cartellis. They're strategizing." Alessandra almost laughed. Strategizing, as if there was any strategy that could undo what had happened today. Marco De Luca had rejected her in front of everyone who mattered. The Romano family's standing had been demolished in a single afternoon. "Tell him I'll be down in a moment," she said. Gianna hesitated. "Alessa, it's not your fault. What Marco did, I know." But did she? Already Alessandra could feel the doubt creeping in. Had she done something wrong during their courtship? Said something that revealed weakness? Failed some test she didn't know she was taking? She pushed the thoughts away. Marco had made his choice, and his reasons were his own. She couldn't control that. All she could control was how she responded. Alessandra changed into a simple black dress, mourning clothes, though she wasn't sure if she was mourning the marriage that didn't happen or the life she'd thought she would have. Then she made her way downstairs to her father's study. The door was ajar and she could hear angry voices before she even entered. "Humiliation is unacceptable. The Romanos will be a laughingstock." That was Carlo Russo, head of the Russo family and one of her father's oldest allies. "We should retaliate," Antonio Cartelli growled. "Show De Luca he can't treat us like this without consequences." "And start a war we can't win?" Her father's voice was strained. "Marco controls the ports, the unions, half the city council. Going after him directly would be suicide." Alessandra pushed the door open fully. 6 men looked up. Her father, her 2 older brothers Marco and Luca, and the heads of the Russo, Cartelli, and Vitale families. All of them were red-faced, drinks in hand, the air thick with cigar smoke and frustrated rage. "Alessandra!" Her father stood immediately. "You shouldn't be here, Piccola. This is business." "This business is about me," she said quietly, stepping into the room. "I think I have a right to hear it." Dante Romano exchanged glances with the other men, then nodded slowly. Very well. Sit. She took a seat in one of the leather armchairs, acutely aware of how all of them were looking at her, with pity, with frustration, with the barely concealed accusation that somehow this was her fault. The situation is this, her father began heavily. Marco's rejection has damaged our family's standing significantly. Already, the Morettis have pulled out of a development deal. The Benedettis are reconsidering their alliance. Without the De Luca marriage, we look weak, vulnerable. We need to show strength, Carlo Russo said, leaning forward. A bold move that proves the Romanos are not to be underestimated, regardless of what De Luca thinks. What kind of move? Alessandra asked. The men exchanged looks again, and she saw her father's jaw tighten. There's been an offer, he said carefully. Vincent Calabrese has proposed a marriage alliance. His eldest son, Tommaso, for you. Alessandra felt her stomach drop. The Calabrese family was powerful, yes, but they were also brutal. Vincent was known for his sadistic streak, and his son Tommaso had inherited it. There were rumors, whispers of women who disappeared, of cruelty that went beyond even the harsh standards of their world. No, she said immediately. Alessandra, I said no. She stood, facing her father directly. I won't trade one marriage of convenience for a worse one just to salvage our pride. This isn't about pride. Dante's voice rose. This is about survival. Without strong alliances, the Romano family will be picked apart by every ambitious organization in Chicago. Do you understand what that means? What they'll do to your mother, your brothers, to you? Then find another way, Alessandra shot back, because I will not marry Tommaso Calabrese. You don't have a choice. Her father's fist slammed on the desk. Your duty is to this family, and if that means what, Papa? If that means suffering, being brutalized, how much am I supposed to sacrifice for a family that just watched me be humiliated and did nothing? The words hung in the air like poison. Alessandra saw her father flinch, saw her brothers look away. We couldn't stop it, Luca said quietly. Marco's too powerful. If we'd tried, I know, Alessandra cut him off. I know you couldn't. I'm not blaming you for what happened today, but I won't let it dictate the rest of my life. There has to be another way. There isn't. Her father sounded suddenly exhausted, older than she'd ever heard him. I've been building this organization for 30 years, Alessandra. I've made alliances, called in favors, done things I'm not proud of to keep this family safe. But Marco's rejection has undone all of it. Without a strong marriage alliance, we're isolated. And in our world, isolated means dead. Alessandra looked at her father, really looked at him. Saw the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the weight of decades pressing down on shoulders that seemed suddenly too narrow to carry it. He'd built an empire, yes, but he'd built it on foundations that could crumble with a single word from someone more powerful, and she was supposed to be the mortar that held it together. Give me time, she said finally. 1 month. Let me see if there's another option before I agree to marry Tommaso Calabrese. A month? Carlo Russo shook his head. In a month, we could lose everything. Then it's a risk you'll have to take, Alessandra said, because I won't be forced into this. Not yet. She left the study before they could argue further, climbed the stairs to her room, and locked the door behind her. Only then did she let herself collapse onto the bed, still wearing the black dress, still holding herself together by sheer force of will. The tears finally came. Not delicate, ladylike tears, but wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the wedding that didn't happen, for the life she'd never have, for the man who'd looked at her with ice in his eyes and told her that caring was weakness. But most of all, she cried because some part of her, some foolish, naive part, had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Marco De Luca might learn to love her, that beneath all that cold calculation, there might be a man worth knowing. Now she knew the truth. Marco had been right about one thing. He was hollow, and hollow men didn't change. 3 days after the failed wedding, Alessandra's life had settled into a strange new rhythm. She didn't leave the estate, couldn't bear to face the knowing looks, the whispered conversations, the pitying smiles. The society pages had already run the story. De Luca heir rejects Romano breed at altar, and her phone had been flooded with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Instead, she spent her days in the estate's library, losing herself in books. Her nights were sleepless, haunted by the memory of Marco's voice saying unsuitable, by the image of 300 people watching her world collapse. Gianna brought her meals, which she mostly didn't eat. Her mother tried to visit, but Alessandra couldn't face Maria Romano's tears, couldn't handle her mother's desperate insistence that marrying Tommaso Calabrese was the only way to save the family. On the fourth day, her brother Marco, named for Marco De Luca in a bitter irony that now seemed prophetic, knocked on her door. "Alessa, can I come in?" She considered pretending to be asleep, but her brother's voice was gentle, lacking the anger that had colored their father's words. "It's open." Marco Romano entered, and Alessandra was struck by how much he'd aged in just a few days. At 30, he was being groomed to take over the family business eventually, and the stress was written in every line of his face. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "How do you think?" He winced. "Fair enough. Stupid question." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I wanted to apologize. For not doing more, for not standing up to him." "You couldn't have," Alessandra said quietly. "None of you could. Marco De Luca he's untouchable." "That doesn't make it right." Her brother's hands clenched into fists. "What he did to you, the way he humiliated you. If he were anyone else, I'd have put a bullet in him myself. But he's not anyone else. He's Marco De Luca. And apparently, I'm not worth the risk of his vulnerability." The words tasted bitter. Her brother looked at her with something like wonder. "The way you stood up to him, though, in front of everyone. Alessa, I've never seen anyone talk to De Luca like that. You were fearless." "I was furious," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Maybe. But you showed more courage in that moment than most men in our world show in a lifetime." He paused. "Papa's pushing the Calabrese marriage hard. Tommaso's already started making arrangements." Alessandra felt ice slide down her spine. "I asked for a month." "I know, but Papa's scared, Alessa. We all are. The Morettis aren't just pulling out of deals anymore. They're actively courting our suppliers, offering better terms. The Benedettis have started moving into our territory. Without strong backing, we're being carved up piece by piece. So I should marry a monster to stop it." "I don't know," Marco said honestly. "I wish I had another answer, but I don't." He stood, moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you deserve better. Better than De Luca, better than Calabrese, better than all of this." After he left, Alessandra sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking about deserving. Did she deserve better? She'd been raised to believe that women in their world didn't get to want things, didn't get to choose. They fulfilled duties, secured alliances, bore children to carry on bloodlines. But Marco De Luca's rejection had shattered something fundamental in that worldview. If she was going to be rejected anyway, if she was going to be deemed unsuitable even when she followed all the rules, then what was the point of the rules at all? Maybe it was time to write her own set. The decision came to her at 3 a.m, in the dead space between night and dawn, when everything felt both impossible and inevitable. If her family needed an alliance to survive, and if Marco De Luca had proven that even perfect obedience wasn't enough to secure one, then maybe it was time to stop being perfect. Time to stop being the quiet, obedient daughter who accepted her fate with grace. Time to make her own moves in the game that had been played with her as a pawn. Alessandra rose from her bed, dressed in dark clothes, and made her way quietly through the estate. The guards were used to her midnight wandering. Insomnia had plagued her since childhood, and no one stopped her as she slipped into her father's study. She knew the combination to his safe, had known it since she was 16 and had figured out that her birthday backwards was the code. Inside was cash, certainly, and probably weapons. But what Alessandra wanted was information. Her father kept files on every major family in Chicago. Intelligence gathered over decades, carefully cataloged, updated regularly. She'd seen him consulting them 1,000 times, making decisions based on the intricate web of alliances and animosities that defined their world. Now she pulled out the file labeled De Luca. It was thick. Years of accumulated information bound in a leather folder. Alessandra brought it to the desk, turned on the small reading lamp, and began to read. What she found was more than just business dealings and territorial maps. Her father had compiled a psychological profile of Marco De Luca, built from observations, from informants, from careful study of the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld. Subject exhibits classic emotional suppression patterns consistent with childhood trauma. Mother's death, age 7, appears to be formative event. Father's subsequent ruthlessness in business dealings likely established model of strength through emotional detachment. Subject maintains no close relationships, no romantic entanglements lasting more than 3 to 4 weeks, appears to deliberately sabotage anything approaching genuine connection. Alessandra felt something twist in her chest. She kept reading. Subject's decision-making is calculated to the point of appearing emotionless, but analysis suggests deep fear underlying this control. Subject appears to believe that caring about others creates exploitable vulnerability. Given his father's assassination, attributed to enemies who targeted his wife as leverage, this belief is not without basis in experience. The pieces began to fall into place. Marco's father had been killed because he'd loved his wife, because that love had been used against him, had become the weapon that ended his life. And Marco had watched it happen, had been 16 years old, already running parts of the business, when his father died trying to save the woman he loved. No wonder Marco equated love with death. No wonder he'd rejected her at the altar rather than risk caring. But understanding his reasons didn't make the rejection hurt less, didn't undo the humiliation, the political damage, the reality that Alessandra was still facing marriage to Tommaso Calabrese if something didn't change. She was about to close the file when she noticed a notation in the margin, in her father's handwriting. De Luca's greatest weakness is his certainty that he has no weaknesses. A man who believes himself invulnerable makes mistakes. Watch for them. Alessandra read the words 3 times, feeling something crystallize in her mind. An idea. Dangerous, probably foolish, but the only move she could see that might change the board. If Marco De Luca believed that caring was weakness, then he would spend his life avoiding it, would surround himself with people who didn't matter, would never let anyone close enough to matter, which meant he would be alone. Truly, deeply alone in a way that no amount of power or control could fix. And maybe, just maybe, that loneliness could be reached, could be made into something other than what he expected. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. Alessandra closed the file, returned it to the safe, and made her way back to her room as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her desk and began to write, working out the details of what would need to happen, what pieces would need to move, what risks she would have to take. By the time the sun was fully up, she had something that almost resembled a strategy. It was insane, possibly suicidal, almost certainly doomed to fail. But it was hers. Her choice, her move, her decision to stop being a pawn and become a player. And if Marco De Luca thought he'd seen the last of Alessandra Romano, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. The plan Alessandra had sketched in the early morning hours seemed less brilliant in the harsh light of day, but she'd committed to it nonetheless. 3 weeks had passed since the failed wedding, and the Romano family's situation had deteriorated exactly as predicted. 2 more allies had pulled their support, a shipment of imported goods had been intercepted, likely by the Morettis, and her father had aged what looked like 10 years in 21 days. The pressure to accept Tommaso Calabrese's proposal had become a daily assault. Her father brought it up at breakfast. Her mother wept about it over lunch. Her brothers cornered her in hallways, their faces grave with the weight of family obligation. But Alessandra had been making preparations of her own. She'd started attending the right parties again, not hiding in her room, but facing the whispers and pitying glances with her head high. She'd made strategic appearances at charity galas, art openings, anywhere the city's elite gathered, and she'd been careful to be seen, to be remembered, to become something more than just the girl Marco De Luca had rejected. She'd also been gathering information, listening to conversations, cataloging grudges, mapping the intricate network of favors and debts that held Chicago's underworld together. If she was going to survive in this world, she needed to understand it better than she ever had before. On a cold October evening, her opportunity finally came. Gianna burst into her room without knocking, her eyes wide. "Alessa, you need to see this." She thrust her phone forward. On the screen was a news alert. Shooting at De Luca Holdings' downtown office. Multiple casualties reported. Alessandra's breath caught. "Is Marco—" "He's alive," Gianna said quickly. "But it was close. 3 of his men are dead, 2 more critical. The Kozlov organization is claiming responsibility. The Kozlovs, Russian mob, expanding aggressively into Chicago territory and known for their brutality. They'd been testing boundaries for months, pushing against established families to see who would push back. Apparently, they'd decided to test Marco DeLuca. "This is going to get ugly," Alessandra said quietly, her mind already racing. A direct attack on DeLuca would demand retaliation, which meant violence, which meant chaos, which meant opportunities for those smart enough to see them. "Your father's calling an emergency meeting," Gianna said. "All the families. They want to discuss a unified response. The Kozlovs are a threat to everyone." Alessandra stood abruptly. "When?" "Tonight. 8 o'clock at the Bellini Hotel." Gianna paused. "Your father said you shouldn't come, that it's too dangerous, that—" "I'll be there," Alessandra said firmly. 2 hours later, she walked into the Bellini's private conference room wearing a black dress that was equal parts mourning and armor. Every head turned as she entered, the only woman in a room full of powerful men who'd built empires on violence and intimidation. Her father's face darkened. "Alessandra, I told you that I shouldn't be here. I heard." She took a seat at the table, ignoring the shocked expressions around her. "But this concerns my family's survival as much as it concerns yours. I have a right to be part of the discussion." Dante Romano looked like he wanted to argue, but Carlo Russo cut in smoothly. "Let the girl stay, Dante. Perhaps a fresh perspective would be useful." The meeting proceeded, tense and heated. Marco DeLuca himself was notably absent, recovering from the attempt on his life, according to his second-in-command, a cold-eyed man named Vincent Greco, who radiated barely controlled rage. "The Kozlovs have declared war," Vincent said flatly. "They hit us in broad daylight, in our own building. This demands immediate and overwhelming retaliation." "Agreed," Antonio Cartelli growled. "We can't let this stand. If the Russians think they can attack with impunity, then we show them the cost of that mistake," Vincent finished. "Mr. DeLuca is proposing a coordinated strike. Hit their operation simultaneously across the city. Send a message that cannot be misunderstood." The men around the table nodded, already discussing logistics, dividing targets, planning violence with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Alessandra listened, watching the way they moved pieces on their mental chessboard, seeing the patterns emerge. And she saw something they didn't, a fatal flaw in their strategy. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "Excuse me?" Vincent Greco's voice was ice. Alessandra met his gaze steadily. "A coordinated strike against the Kozlovs will escalate this into a full war. You'll win, eventually. The families have more resources, better connections, deeper roots in the city. But it will be costly. Men will die. Territories will be damaged. And in the chaos, other organizations will move in to take advantage. What would you suggest instead?" Her father's tone was sharp. "That we do nothing? I suggest we be smarter than they expect." Alessandra leaned forward. "The Kozlovs attacked because they see weakness, division among the families. They think if they hit hard enough, you'll fracture instead of unifying. So prove them wrong, but do it strategically." "Go on," Carlo Russo said, and there was genuine interest in his voice now. "Retaliate, yes, but make it surgical. Hit their leadership, their money, their ability to coordinate. Don't give them the war they're trying to provoke. Give them a demonstration of exactly why they should never have challenged established families in the first place." She paused. "And then offer them a way out. Let them retreat with their lives if they withdraw from Chicago entirely." Vincent Greco's laugh was harsh. "You want us to show mercy to the people who just tried to kill Marco DeLuca?" "I want you to show strength," Alessandra corrected. "Real strength isn't just the ability to destroy. It's the ability to control when and how you destroy. The Kozlovs expect rage. Give them calculated precision instead, and they'll understand they're outmatched." The men exchanged glances, and Alessandra saw the moment her strategy took root. It appealed to them, not because it was merciful, but because it was efficient. Less risk, more control, and the opportunity to demonstrate sophistication rather than just brute force. It has merit, Antonio Cartelli said slowly. A surgical approach would minimize our exposure. The discussion shifted, incorporating her suggestions, building on them. Alessandra watched her father's expression cycle through shock, frustration, and finally grudging respect. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, Vincent Greco approached her. Mr. DeLuca will want to hear about this conversation. Would you be willing to meet with him? Alessandra's heart kicked against her ribs. This was what she'd been angling for, a chance to see Marco again, to put the next phase of her plan into motion. But she kept her expression neutral. When? Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. His estate in Lake Forest. I'll be there. That night, back in her room, Alessandra allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of panic. Seeing Marco again meant facing the man who'd humiliated her, who'd rejected her in front of everyone who mattered. It meant risking further hurt, further damage to pride that was already in tatters. But it also meant opportunity, a chance to prove she was more than he'd assumed, more than unsuitable. She spent the rest of the night preparing, choosing her armor carefully. Not too formal, that would seem like she was trying too hard. Not too casual, that would suggest disrespect. In the end, she settled on charcoal gray, elegant but understated, with her grandmother's pearls as the only jewelry. When her car pulled up to the DeLuca estate the following afternoon, Alessandra took a moment to steady her breathing. The property was massive, all stone and iron gates, surrounded by enough security to repel a small army. Guards checked her identification 3 times before allowing her through. Vincent Greco met her at the front entrance. Miss Romano, thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation. He led her through the house, all dark wood and expensive art, beautiful in the way mausoleums were beautiful, to a study overlooking the lake. And there, sitting behind a desk that probably cost more than most cars, was Marco DeLuca. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner, maybe. The attempt on his life had left him with a healing cut along his jaw, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But his gaze was as cold and assessing as ever. Miss Romano. He didn't stand, didn't offer any of the courtesies he might extend to a guest. Vincent tells me you had interesting suggestions at last night's meeting. I offered a perspective, Alessandra said, refusing to be intimidated. Whether you find it interesting is your concern. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Sit. She took the chair across from his desk, crossing her ankles in a pose her mother had drilled into her since childhood. Marco studied her for a long moment, and she bore the scrutiny without flinching. You've changed, he said finally. People tend to change when their lives are dismantled in front of 300 witnesses. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and unforgiving. Marco's expression didn't shift, but something flickered in his eyes. You're angry. I'm practical, Alessandra corrected. Anger is a luxury I can't afford. My family needs me to be smart, not emotional. And is that what last night was? Being smart? It was reading a room and seeing an opportunity to contribute. She met his gaze directly. Something I've learned to do in the 3 weeks since you decided I was unsuitable for your purposes. There, a direct hit. She saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his fingers tensed on the armrest of his chair. I explained my reasons, he said, his voice carefully controlled. You did, and I've had plenty of time to think about them. Alessandra leaned forward slightly. Here's what I've concluded. You were right about one thing. Caring about someone can make you vulnerable, but you were wrong about the solution. Refusing to care doesn't make you strong, it just makes you isolated. And isolated men, no matter how powerful, eventually fall. Is that a threat, Miss Romano? It's an observation, she paused. The Kozlovs attacked you because they think you're untouchable. Because they believe your reputation for invincibility makes you a valuable target. But reputation isn't the same as reality. You can be hurt. You can be killed. The question is whether you're smart enough to accept that and plan accordingly. Marco stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the lake. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. You think you understand me. I think I understand fear when I see it, Alessandra said quietly. You rejected me at the altar because you were afraid. Not of me specifically, but of what I represented. The possibility of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy you. He turned, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, his mask cracked. My father died because he loved my mother too much, because his enemies knew they could use her against him. I watched him walk into a trap to save her, and I watched them both die anyway. So yes, I'm afraid of that. Any rational person would be. But you're not just afraid of losing someone you love, Alessandra continued. You're afraid of being the kind of man who loves at all, because in your mind that man is weak, foolish, doomed. She stood, crossing to where he stood by the window. But what if you're wrong? What if the man who loves and loses is stronger than the man who never loves at all? What if your father's choice wasn't weakness? It was the most courageous thing he ever did. Marco's laugh was bitter. Courage that got him killed. Courage that meant he didn't die alone, Alessandra countered. Courage that gave his life meaning beyond power and control. You've spent 15 years building an empire, Marco. You have money, influence, fear, respect. But do you have anything worth dying for? The question landed like a blow. She saw it in the way he flinched, in the sudden rawness that crossed his face before he could hide it. I have my organization, he said finally. My people, my legacy. You have assets, Alessandra corrected gently. Not the same thing. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, and Alessandra felt the tension between them shift into something new. Not attraction exactly, though she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward this complicated, damaged man, but recognition, a sense that they were both fighting battles no one else could see. Why did you really come here today? Marco asked. Because Vincent invited me. Don't play games. You could have declined. You could have sent your father. But you came yourself, knowing I'd be here, knowing this conversation would happen. His gaze sharpened. Why? Alessandra took a breath, committing to the truth. Because I wanted to see if the man who rejected me was as hollow as I thought, and because... She hesitated, then pushed forward. Because I think you made a mistake. Not just in rejecting me, though you did, but in assuming that strength and vulnerability can't coexist. And you think you can prove me wrong? I think I already have, she said quietly. I stood up at that altar after you destroyed me, and I walked away with my head high. I faced down the whispers and the pity and the knowledge that every person in our world thinks I wasn't good enough for you. And I survived. More than survived. I'm here, standing in your study, telling you that you're afraid. If that's not strength paired with vulnerability, I don't know what is. Marco stared at her for a long moment, and Alessandra saw something shift in his expression. The ice didn't melt, not completely, but it cracked, just enough to reveal something almost like wonder beneath. You really are fearless, he said. I'm terrified, she corrected, but I'm doing it anyway. That's what courage actually is. The conversation shifted back to business after that. The Kozlov situation, strategy, logistics. But something had changed between them. Marco listened to her suggestions with genuine attention, asked her opinion on tactics, treated her like someone whose intelligence mattered. When she finally left 2 hours later, Vincent Greco walked her to her car. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone bitter, broken, maybe? He paused. Instead, you're dangerous. Alessandra smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. The drive back to Kenilworth gave her time to process what had happened. She'd gone to Marco's estate with a plan, prove she was more than he'd assumed, establish herself as someone worth reconsidering. And she'd succeeded, at least partially. But she'd also learned something unexpected. Marco DeLuca wasn't hollow. He was wounded, defending himself with coldness because it was the only armor that had ever worked. And wounded things, Alessandra knew, could be healed, if she was brave enough to try. Over the next 2 weeks, the Kozlov situation unfolded exactly as Alessandra had predicted. The families executed surgical strikes against Russian operations, crippling their ability to coordinate without triggering the full-scale war the Kozlovs had hoped for. Within 10 days, the remaining Kozlov leadership reached out through intermediaries requesting terms for withdrawal. Marco handled the negotiations himself, and to everyone's surprise, he offered exactly what Alessandra had suggested, a way out. The Russians could leave Chicago with their lives if they surrendered their territory and agreed never to return. They took the deal. The victory solidified the family's united front and demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that earned respect throughout the underworld. And Alessandra, who'd suggested the approach, found her own reputation quietly growing. Her father noticed. "You've been spending time with DeLuca," he said one evening over dinner. "I've been consulting on the Kozlov situation," Alessandra corrected. "Is that all?" Her mother's eyes were sharp with hope. "That's all, Mama." She set down her fork. "Marco DeLuca rejected me publicly. Whatever relationship we might build now, it won't be romantic. He's made his position clear." But even as she said the words, Alessandra wondered if they were true. Because Marco had started calling her. Nothing personal, always business. But the conversations had grown longer, more wide-ranging. They'd discuss strategy, debate tactics, argue about the best approach to various situations. And sometimes, late at night when the business was finished, they'd talk about other things. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, the weight of family expectations, and the cost of leadership. Alessandra found herself looking forward to those calls. Found herself staying up past midnight, phone pressed to her ear, listening to Marco's voice discuss everything and nothing. Found herself forgetting sometimes that this was supposed to be strategy. It was during one of those late-night calls that everything changed. "There's a situation," Marco said without preamble. "The Volkov family, cousins to the Kozlovs, they're not accepting the withdrawal terms." Alessandra sat up straighter in bed. What do they want? Revenge. They've issued threats against everyone involved in the negotiations, including, he paused, including you. Her blood ran cold. Me? I'm not even... You suggested the strategy that humiliated them. Your name was mentioned in the terms discussions. His voice was tight. Alessandra, these people are serious. They've already made 2 attempts on Cartelli's daughter. Failed attempts, but attempts nonetheless. What do you suggest? Protection. My protection specifically. He said it quickly, like he'd been rehearsing. Move into a secured property where my men can watch you properly, until this is resolved. And my family? Will be protected as well, but you're the specific target. The threat is against you personally. Alessandra's mind raced. Moving into Marco's protection meant proximity, meant days and nights in close quarters with the man who'd rejected her, meant putting herself in a position of dependence that could be exploited. It also meant safety, real safety, in a way her family's increasingly diminished resources couldn't provide. There's another option, Marco said into her silence. The original option. The one I rejected. Her breath caught. Marco. Marriage. The word fell between them like a stone in still water. If you were my wife, the protection would be absolute. No one would touch you without triggering immediate and overwhelming retaliation. It would also shore up your family's position. The Romano de Luca alliance your father wanted. You said caring about me would make you weak. I was wrong. His voice was raw now, stripped of its usual control. These past weeks, watching you navigate our world with courage I don't possess, listening to your strategies, hearing your perspective, I've realized something. You don't make me weak, Alessandra. You make me want to be better than I am. Tears pricked at her eyes. That's not the same as love. No, he agreed. It's not. I don't know if I'm capable of love. Not the way normal people are. But I know I care about you. I know the thought of you being hurt terrifies me more than any business threat ever has. And I know that if I lose you because I'm too afraid to risk vulnerability, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. You humiliated me, Alessandra whispered. In front of everyone. You said I was unsuitable. I know. And I'm sorrier for that than you can possibly understand. He took a shaky breath. I can't undo it, but I can try to make it right. If you'll let me. Alessandra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake, that Marco De Luca had proven himself untrustworthy, that marrying him would be trading one cage for another. But her heart, her stubborn, foolish heart, remembered the vulnerability in his voice when he'd talked about his parents, remembered the way he'd listened to her strategies with genuine respect, remembered the late-night phone calls where they'd talked until dawn. "If I agree," she said carefully, "this won't be the marriage my father originally arranged. It won't be about politics or alliances or maintaining appearances. What will it be about? Honesty, partnership. You said you want me as an equal. I'll hold you to that." She paused. "And if you ever reject me again, publicly or privately, if you ever treat me as unsuitable or weak or anything other than your partner, I will walk away. Permanently. Are we clear?" Crystal. "Then yes," Alessandra said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'll marry you. But this time, Marco, this time we do it right." The second wedding was nothing like the first. No cathedral filled with 300 witnesses, no silk and diamonds, no orchestras or elaborate floral arrangements. Instead, Marco's private attorney arrived at the Lake Forest estate on a gray November morning with the necessary documents, and Alessandra signed her name beside Marco's in a study that smelled of leather and old books. Vincent Greco and Gianna served as witnesses. Her family wasn't there. Her father had raged for 2 days when she'd told him, unable to comprehend why she'd agree to marry the man who'd humiliated her. Her mother had wept, convinced this was some form of punishment Alessandra was inflicting on herself. Only her brother Marco had understood, pulling her aside the night before to whisper that he hoped she knew what she was doing. She didn't, not really, but she was doing it anyway. When the attorney declared them legally married, Marco took her hand, his palm warm, his grip steady, and met her eyes with an intensity that stole her breath. "I won't fail you again," he said quietly. "I swear it." Alessandra wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this man who'd spent 15 years building walls around his heart could actually learn to let her in. But trust, she'd learned, wasn't given freely. It was earned through action, through time, through the 1,000 small choices that either built something real or revealed the cracks beneath. "We'll see," she said, squeezing his fingers once before releasing them. The first week of marriage was an exercise in careful navigation. Marco had insisted she move into the Lake Forest estate immediately. The Volkov threats were escalating, and his security was the most comprehensive in Chicago. Alessandra had agreed, though leaving her family home felt like severing the last thread connecting her to the life she'd known. The estate was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way. Expensive furniture arranged with mathematical precision, art chosen for investment value rather than aesthetic pleasure, rooms that felt more like showpieces than living spaces. It reminded Alessandra of Marco himself, impressive but isolated, carefully controlled, lacking any real warmth. Her new husband was unfailingly polite. He showed her through the house, introduced her to the household staff, ensured she had everything she needed. But there was a distance between them that felt deliberate, as if he was still uncertain how to navigate this new relationship. They slept in separate bedrooms. Marco had insisted on it the first night, claiming he didn't want to rush her, that they could take time to adjust before making their marriage physical. Alessandra had agreed, though she suspected his reasoning had more to do with his own fear than any consideration for her comfort. On the third night, she found him in his study past midnight, surrounded by reports and photographs, intelligence on the Volkov family's operations. "You should be sleeping," he said without looking up. "So should you." Alessandra crossed to the desk, studying the materials spread across its surface. "How bad is it?" Marco leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Worse than I thought. The Volkovs have more resources than we anticipated. They've been building alliances, calling in favors. 3 families are considering supporting them, not openly, but enough to complicate things." "Which families?" He told her, and Alessandra felt her mind start working through the implications. The Benedettis made sense. They'd never forgiven Marco for a territory dispute 5 years ago. The Torres family was predictable. They resented DeLuca dominance and would welcome any opportunity to challenge it. But the Grecos were a surprise. "Vincent's family?" she asked carefully. "Distant cousins. There's bad blood." Marco's expression was tight. "Vincent's loyal, but his uncle Antonio has always resented that Vincent chose to work for me instead of building the Greco organization. This is his chance to prove Vincent made the wrong choice." "Can we turn them?" "The Benedettis and Torres, maybe. They're motivated by profit more than principle." He paused. "But Antonio Greco wants blood. Specifically, mine. He's been waiting years for this opportunity. Alessandra pulled up a chair, settling in beside him. Then we don't give it to him. Walk me through what we know. They spent the next 3 hours mapping out connections, identifying leverage points, building a strategy that would isolate the Volkovs instead of letting them build a coalition. Marco listened to her suggestions with the same focused attention he'd shown during the Kozlov negotiations, occasionally pushing back with questions that sharpened her thinking. It felt natural, working together like this, as if they'd been partners for years instead of days. And when Marco finally closed the last folder and met her eyes, there was something new in his expression, something almost like contentment. "You're brilliant," he said quietly. "I'm practical," Alessandra corrected, echoing their earlier conversation. "There's a difference." "No. You're brilliant." He reached across the space between them, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart stumble. "And I'm grateful you're here." She should have pulled away, should have maintained the careful distance they'd established. But instead, Alessandra leaned into his touch, letting her eyes close for just a moment. "Marco." "I know." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "Too soon, too fast. But I needed you to know." When she finally went to bed that night, Alessandra lay awake for hours, feeling the ghost of his touch on her skin and wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest choice. The following week brought the first test of their partnership. The Benedetti family requested a meeting, not with Marco alone, but with both of them. It was unprecedented, treating a wife as an equal negotiating partner, and Marco's advisors had argued against it. "It shows weakness," Vincent had said, "like you can't handle your own business." But Marco had overruled them. "My wife is my partner. If the Benedettis want to negotiate, they negotiate with both of us." Now they sat across from Lorenzo Benedetti and his son in a private room at an upscale restaurant, the tension thick enough to taste. Lorenzo was in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a man who'd built his empire on information and intimidation in equal measure. "Mrs. DeLuca," he said, the title heavy with significance. "I must admit I'm surprised to see you here." "Why?" Alessandra kept her voice level. "I'm half of this partnership." "Are you?" Lorenzo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Forgive my skepticism, but your husband has a reputation for making decisions unilaterally. I'm curious whether your presence here is substance or theater." "There's one way to find out," Alessandra said calmly. "Make your offer and see who responds." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. The Volkovs have approached us with a proposal. They're offering territory in exchange for supporting their claim against Marco. Specifically, against both of you. They've made it clear that Mrs. DeLuca's role in the Kozlov negotiations makes her equally responsible for their family's humiliation." "And you're considering it?" Marco's voice was ice. "I'm considering all my options," Lorenzo replied. "The Volkovs are offering generous terms, but I'm also aware that accepting their offer means making an enemy of the DeLuca organization. So I'm here to see if you can make a better one." Marco started to speak, but Alessandra placed a hand on his arm, a subtle signal to wait. He tensed, then relaxed fractionally, yielding the floor to her. "Mr. Benedetti," she began, "you're right that the Volkovs are offering you territory, but let's be honest about what that territory actually represents. The areas they're promising are disputed, either actively contested by other families or so unstable that holding them would require constant military presence. They're offering you the privilege of bleeding resources to maintain claims that may never fully materialize." Lorenzo's expression sharpened with interest. "And what are you offering instead?" "Stability. The DeLuca organization controls the ports, which means we control import flow. We're prepared to offer you preferential rates on shipping, 20% below your current costs, plus guaranteed protection for your shipments. No raids, no lost cargo, no mysterious delays." She leaned forward slightly. "That's not territory, Mr. Benedetti. That's profit. Real, immediate, sustainable profit." "In exchange for?" "Neutrality. Don't support the Volkovs, don't oppose us, and maintain your current agreements with all parties. We're not asking you to become our allies, just to stay out of a fight that doesn't benefit you." Lorenzo exchanged glances with his son, and Alessandra saw the moment her offer landed. She was giving him exactly what he actually wanted, Not territory he'd have to fight for, but money he could count. The shipping rates would be formalized? Lorenzo asked. In writing, legally binding, renewable annually with escalation clauses tied to market rates, Alessandra confirmed. My husband and I would both sign. 25% reduction, Lorenzo countered. 22, Marco said, entering the negotiation smoothly. And we guarantee your volumes won't be cut to subsidize other families. The haggling continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. By the time they left the restaurant, the Benedettis had agreed to neutrality in exchange for shipping concessions that would cost the De Luca organization far less than fighting a war on multiple fronts. In the car back to the estate, Marco was quiet. Alessandra waited, watching the city lights streak past the windows, until finally he spoke. That was masterful. That was necessary, she corrected. The Benedettis were never going to commit to the Volkovs. They're too smart for that. They just wanted to extract maximum value from the situation. And you gave them a better option than I would have offered. He turned to look at her. I would have gone in with threats, power plays, made it about dominance. Which would have worked, probably, but it would have left resentment. Alessandra met his gaze. This way, they feel like they won something, which means they'll honor the agreement instead of looking for ways to undermine it. Marco reached across the seat, taking her hand in his. Vincent was wrong. Having you as my partner doesn't make me look weak, it makes me look smart. Then maybe you should listen to your wife more often, Alessandra said lightly, but her pulse was racing at the feel of his fingers intertwined with hers. Maybe I should, he agreed, and the weight in his voice suggested he wasn't just talking about business anymore. That night, after they debriefed Vincent and the other advisors on the Benedetti agreement, Marco walked Alessandra to her bedroom door, a nightly ritual they'd established, one of those small gestures that suggested a relationship deeper than their hastily signed marriage certificate indicated. I meant what I said in the car, he told her, his hand still holding hers from the walk upstairs. You're extraordinary, Alessandra. Not just skilled, not just intelligent, truly extraordinary. Marco, she wasn't sure what she wanted to say, what she was ready to admit. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face with that same gentleness that undid her every time. I know I have no right to ask this. I know I hurt you, that I destroyed your trust, that you have every reason to keep me at arm's length forever. But I'm asking anyway. Asking what? For a real chance. Not a marriage of convenience, not a political alliance. A real marriage, with everything that means. His thumb brushed her lower lip, and Alessandra felt heat flood through her. I want to know you, Alessandra. All of you. Not just the brilliant strategist, but the woman who reads poetry at 3 a.m, who argues with me about philosophy, who makes me feel things I thought I'd buried so deep they could never surface. Her breath caught. You've been paying attention to every word, every gesture, every moment. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. Tell me I haven't destroyed this completely. Tell me there's a chance you might someday feel something for me beyond strategic partnership. Alessandra closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his breath against her skin, the solid strength of him so close she could count his heartbeats. Every rational part of her brain screamed caution. This man had proven he could hurt her, had shown that fear could make him cruel. But he'd also shown he could change, could admit mistakes, could value her not just as an asset, but as a person worth knowing. I already feel something, she whispered. That's what terrifies me. Marco pulled back just enough to see her face, his eyes searching hers. What do you feel? Hope. That you might actually mean what you're saying, that this might become something real. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. But also fear. Because you hurt me once, Marco. Deeply. And if you do it again, I don't know if I could survive it. I won't, he said fiercely. Alessandra, I swear to you. Don't swear. She placed her fingers over his lips. Just show me. Every day, with your actions, show me that you mean it, that I matter to you beyond what I can offer strategically. He kissed her fingertips, the gesture so tender it made her ache. I can do that. I want to do that. Then do it, she breathed, starting now. Marco's kiss was nothing like she'd expected. She'd imagined possession, dominance, the same controlled calculation he brought to everything else. Instead, it was reverent, almost worshipful, his mouth moving against hers with a gentleness that suggested he was handling something precious. Alessandra sank into it, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. She felt him shudder, felt the careful control start to slip as he deepened the kiss, one hand spanning her waist, while the other cradled her head. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marco rested his forehead against hers again. "Come to bed with me," he whispered. "Not because it's expected, not because it's duty, but because you want to. Because you want me." "I do want you," Alessandra admitted, "but I'm still scared." "Then we'll be scared together." He pulled back to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes stole her breath. "I'm terrified, Alessandra. Terrified of failing you, of proving I'm as hollow as you thought, of losing you before I've even really had you. But I'm choosing to trust that we can build something worth the risk." She studied his face, the sharp angles, the silver at his temples, the healing scar on his jaw from the attempt on his life. This complicated, damaged man who'd rejected her once and was now asking for everything. It was insane, reckless, possibly the biggest gamble she'd ever take. But looking into his eyes, seeing the naked hope there, Alessandra realized she'd already made her choice. Had made it weeks ago when she'd walked into his study and chosen to fight for something better than fear. "Yes," she said simply. She let him lead her to his room, larger than hers, dominated by a massive bed that had probably never held anyone besides him. Marco turned on a single lamp, casting everything in warm amber light, then came back to her. "We can stop whenever you want," he said, his hands gentle as they found the zipper of her dress. "Just say the word." But Alessandra was done with words. She helped him with the zipper, let the dress pool at her feet, stood before him in silk and vulnerability. Marco's breath caught, his hands skating up her sides with something like reverence. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "I thought it the first time I saw you, and I've thought it every moment since. But this, seeing you choose to be here with me, is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." She reached for his shirt buttons, her fingers fumbling slightly. "You're wearing too many clothes." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and helped her, stripping away the expensive suit until they were skin to skin. And then he was lifting her, carrying her to the bed, laying her down like she was something precious. What followed was a revelation. Marco made love to her with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else, learning her body like he was studying for an exam. He paid attention to every gasp, every shiver, adjusting his approach based on her responses until Alessandra was trembling beneath him, lost in sensation. But what undid her completely was the way he looked at her throughout, like she was the most important thing in his universe, like nothing else mattered beyond this moment, this connection. It was the opposite of hollow. It was devastating in its fullness. When they finally lay tangled together afterward, both breathing hard, Marco pulled her close against his chest. His heart was hammering beneath her ear, his arms solid around her. "Stay," he whispered into her hair. "Not just tonight. Always." Alessandra tilted her head up to look at him. "I'm your wife, Marco. Where else would I go?" "That's not what I mean." His hand came up to cup her face. "Stay with me. In this. Don't retreat behind walls when things get difficult. Don't give up on us when I inevitably make mistakes. Just stay." She saw it then, the real fear beneath all his control. He wasn't afraid of caring about her. He was afraid she'd leave once she realized he didn't know how to be what she needed. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "But you have to promise me something too." "Anything. Don't push me away again. When you're scared, when you feel vulnerable, when every instinct tells you to close off, fight it. Talk to me instead. Let me in." She paused. "Can you do that?" Marco was quiet for a long moment, and she felt the tension in his body. This was harder for him than any business negotiation, any strategic decision. This required trust in a way nothing else ever had. "I'll try," he said finally. "I can't promise I'll be perfect at it, but I'll try." "That's all I ask," Alessandra whispered, and kissed him again. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time since the failed wedding, Alessandra felt something like peace. The peace lasted exactly 4 days. Alessandra was in the estate's library, reviewing contracts for a property deal, when Vincent Greco burst through the door. His face was ashen, his usual composure shattered. "Where's Marco?" he demanded. "Meeting with the accountants in the city. What's wrong?" Vincent's jaw worked. "It's the Volkovs. They've made their move." Ice flooded through her veins. "What kind of move?" "They've kidnapped Sofia Russo, Carlo's daughter." Vincent's hands were shaking. "They're demanding we withdraw all support from the Romano De Luca alliance. They want you specifically handed over to them as compensation for their losses." Alessandra felt the room tilt. Sofia Russo was 19, still in college, barely involved in family business. Taking her was a message. No one was safe, not even the innocent. "When did this happen?" 2 hours ago. She was leaving campus when they grabbed her." Vincent's expression was murderous. "Carlo's going insane. He's already mobilized his soldiers, talking about burning down every Volkov property in the city." "Which is exactly what they want," Alessandra said, her mind racing despite the fear. "They're trying to provoke a response so massive it fractures the alliance. Carlo attacks, other families pull back afraid of the escalation, and suddenly we're isolated. So what do we do?" "We find Sofia before Carlo does something that destroys everything." She stood, already moving toward the door. "Get Marco on the phone. Tell him I'm mobilizing our intelligence network. Every contact, every informant, everything we have. And tell him—" She paused. "Tell him the Volkovs just made their biggest mistake." Because threatening Alessandra was one thing, but taking an innocent girl to use as leverage, that was different. That crossed a line that even in their brutal world, you didn't cross. And the Volkovs were about to learn exactly what happened when you made an enemy of people who had nothing left to lose. Marco arrived at the estate 30 minutes later, flanked by 6 armed men and radiating a fury so cold it could freeze blood. He found Alessandra in the security room, surrounded by monitors and phone transcripts, coordinating with their intelligence network like a general marshalling troops for war. "Tell me everything," he said without preamble. She didn't look up from the screen showing traffic camera footage near Sofia's campus. The Volkovs grabbed her at 11:47 a.m. from the north parking lot. 3 men, professional execution, in and out in under 90 seconds. They used a white cargo van, switched vehicles twice. We lost the trail at a warehouse district on the south side. Demands? Delivered to Carlo 20 minutes ago. They want the alliance dissolved, all families to withdraw support from us, and she finally met his eyes. They want me delivered to them within 48 hours, or they start sending Sofia back in pieces. Marco's expression went absolutely murderous. "That's not happening." "I know." Alessandra turned back to the screens. "Which is why we have 47 hours and 13 minutes to find her. Vincent's team is running down the warehouse district lead. I've got our contacts in the Russian community asking questions, and I've reached out to the FBI. That made Marco's head snap up. "The feds?" "Agent Sarah Chen. She's been investigating the Volkovs for money laundering. She'll want Sofia safe almost as much as we do, and she has resources we don't." Alessandra pulled up another screen showing a map of known Volkov properties. "But our best chance is still finding her ourselves. The Volkovs are careful, but they're also arrogant. They'll have kept her somewhere they consider secure." "Where's Carlo?" Marco asked Vincent. "At his estate, surrounded by about 50 armed men, and getting more unstable by the minute." Vincent's expression was grim. "He's threatened to torch every Russian business in Chicago if we don't produce Sofia by midnight." "That gives us less time than the Volkov's deadline," Alessandra said. "We need to find her in the next 12 hours or Carlo's going to start a war that benefits nobody but our enemies." Marco moved to stand beside her, studying the screens with the same focused intensity he'd shown in their strategy sessions. But there was something different now, a barely contained violence simmering beneath his control. Alessandra recognized it, had seen glimpses of it before. This was the man who'd built an empire on calculated ruthlessness, who'd survived in a world where weakness meant death. This was the man who would burn down the entire city to protect what was his, and somehow she'd become part of that equation. "What do you need?" he asked her. "Access to your offshore accounts. the ones you use for untraceable transactions. She pulled up a financial tracking program. The Volkovs are planning something beyond just using Sophia as leverage. This kidnapping required coordination, safe houses, bribed officials. That means money moving through channels they think are secure. If we can trace the payments, you'll find the location. Marco was already pulling out his phone, typing in access codes. Vincent, get our financial analyst team here immediately. And someone get Carlo on the line. We need to keep him from doing something catastrophic. The next 6 hours were a blur of data analysis, phone calls, and increasingly desperate searches. Alessandra coordinated between multiple teams, her mind working through possibilities and eliminating dead ends with a speed that impressed even Marco's veteran operatives. Agent Chen came through with satellite imagery of the warehouse district. Vincent's team identified 3 properties with recent unusual activity. Marco's financial analyst traced 17 suspicious transactions that all led back to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. But it was Alessandra who made the connection that mattered. Here, she said, pointing to a transaction dated 3 days before Sophia's kidnapping. Payment to a security company for facility upgrades at a property in Hammond, Indiana, just across the state line. It's listed as industrial storage, but the amount is excessive for what they're claiming. Marco leaned over her shoulder, studying the information. Hammond's 40 minutes from Chicago. Close enough to move Sophia quickly, far enough that local cops won't be as responsive to Chicago family politics. And look at the ownership trail. Alessandra pulled up the property records. It goes through 4 shell companies before landing with a name that doesn't exist, but the original purchase was made by a Dmitry Volkov. Marco finished, his voice deadly quiet. Alexei Volkov's uncle, the one who actually runs their operations while Alexei plays figurehead. This is it, Vincent said, already mobilizing. It has to be. Call Carlo, Marco ordered. Tell him we have a location and we're moving now. Tell him if he wants his daughter back alive, he stays put and lets us handle this. He won't agree to that, Vincent said. Then lie. Marco's voice was ice. Tell him we need him to coordinate from his position, that his men are our backup plan, whatever it takes to keep him from charging in and getting Sophia killed. While Vincent made the call, Marco turned to Alessandra. You're staying here. No, I'm not. Alessandra, they took her because of me, she said firmly. Because I helped strategize against their family. This is my responsibility. Which is exactly why you're staying here, where it's safe. Marco's hands came up to frame her face. If something happened to you, then you'd survive it, because you're strong enough to. She covered his hands with hers. But Marco, I can't sit here while a girl suffers because of choices I made. I can't do it. She saw the war in his eyes, the desperate need to protect her warring with his understanding of why this mattered. Finally, he closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. You stay in the vehicle. No matter what happens, you stay in the armored SUV with 2 guards. Agreed? Agreed. He pulled her close, kissing her hard, a kiss that tasted like fear and fury and something deeper than either. I just got you. I'm not ready to lose you. You won't, she promised, though she had no idea if it was a promise she could keep. 20 minutes later, a convoy of 5 vehicles was speeding toward Hammond, Indiana. Alessandra rode with Marco and Vincent in the lead SUV, watching the city lights give way to industrial wasteland as they crossed the state line. Marco was on the phone constantly, coordinating with his team, confirming the plan. They'd hit the warehouse from 3 sides simultaneously, overwhelming force designed to secure Sophia before the Volkovs could harm her. It was risky, but waiting was riskier. 2 minutes out, the driver said. Marco ended his call, checked his weapon with practiced efficiency, then looked at Alessandra. Promise me you'll stay in the vehicle. I promise. He kissed her once more, quick and fierce, then was gone. Out of the SUV and into the darkness, with Vincent and a dozen armed men flowing around him like a lethal tide. Alessandra watched through the vehicle's tinted windows, her heart in her throat. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive concrete structure that had probably been abandoned for years before the Volkovs repurposed it. Perfect for hiding someone. Perfect for things no one should ever have to witness. Marco's team moved with military precision. They'd cut the power to the building 30 seconds earlier. She saw the lights go dark through the high windows. Now they were breaching the entrances, flashlights cutting through the darkness, weapons raised. The sounds of gunfire shattered the night. Alessandra flinched despite herself, her hands clenching in her lap. The two guards assigned to protect her were tense, weapons drawn, scanning the perimeter for threats. More gunfire, shouting in Russian and English. The crack of something explosive, maybe a flashbang. Through the chaos, she tried to track Marco's position, but the darkness made it impossible. Then, abruptly, silence. Alessandra's phone buzzed. A text from Marco. "We have her. She's alive." Relief flooded through her so powerfully she felt dizzy. Sofia was safe. Whatever else happened tonight, that mattered most. But then she heard it, the screech of tires behind them. She turned to see headlights barreling toward their position, a second vehicle coming from the opposite direction. "We've got incoming!" one of her guards shouted, already moving to engage. The attack was coordinated, professional. The Volkovs had anticipated the rescue attempt and set a trap within their trap, a team positioned to grab Alessandra while Marco's forces were occupied inside the warehouse. The first vehicle slammed into their SUV's rear quarter panel, the armored frame absorbing most of the impact but still jolting everyone inside. Armed men poured out, weapons raised, and Alessandra's guards returned fire through the reinforced windows. She dropped to the floor of the vehicle, her heart hammering, as bullets pinged off the armored exterior. This was what Marco had feared, why he'd wanted her to stay behind. And she'd insisted on coming anyway, had promised to stay safe, and now she was trapped in a firefight while he was inside the warehouse with no idea she was in danger. One of her guards was shouting into his radio, calling for backup. The other was returning fire with grim efficiency. But there were too many attackers, and they were using the second vehicle as cover to advance. Alessandra's mind raced. The SUV was armored but not invincible. If they had explosives, or armor-piercing rounds, or enough time to coordinate a proper assault, they'd get through eventually. And Marco couldn't help. Pulling his forces out of the warehouse would leave Sofia vulnerable. She had to do something. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay down, Alessandra grabbed the radio from the fallen guard. "Marco, I'm under attack. South side of the building. Don't pull your men. We'll handle it." His response was immediate and furious. "Alessandra, stay down." "I am down, but they're going to breach the vehicle." She could hear them outside, coordinating in Russian. "I need you to finish inside and get out here. We'll hold until then." 30 seconds. Marco's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Hold for 30 seconds." Those 30 seconds felt like hours. The attackers had reached the SUV, were trying to force the doors. One of her guards was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. The other was still firing, but his ammunition was running low. Alessandra searched the vehicle for anything she could use as a weapon. Found a pistol in the console. She'd learned to shoot as a teenager, her father's insistence that she know how to protect herself. Her hands shook as she checked the magazine, but she forced them steady through sheer will. The door locks were giving way. Another few seconds and they'd be inside. Then she heard it, the roar of Marco's voice, the thunder of footsteps, the sudden explosion of gunfire as his team burst out of the warehouse and engaged the attackers from behind. The Volkov soldiers never had a chance. Caught between Alessandra's guards and Marco's overwhelming force, they were eliminated with brutal efficiency. The whole engagement lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When the shooting stopped, Marco wrenched open the SUV door. His face was spattered with blood. Not his, she hoped, and his eyes were wild with fear and fury. "Are you hurt?" His hands were all over her, checking for injuries with shaking fingers. "I'm fine. Marco, I'm fine." She caught his hands, stilling them. "The guards took the worst of it. Is Sofia safe?" "Vincent's getting her medical attention." He pulled Alessandra out of the vehicle into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "You promised you'd stay safe." "I tried." She buried her face in his chest, letting herself shake now that the immediate danger had passed. "They were waiting for us." "I know." His voice was rough. "This was a trap within a trap. They wanted Sofia as bait to draw us out, but their real target was you." He pulled back to look at her, his expression fierce. "They failed, and now they're going to pay for it." 4 Volkov soldiers had survived the assault. Marco had them lined up against the warehouse wall, his men keeping weapons trained on them while he made a phone call. "Who is he calling?" Alessandra asked Vincent, who'd come out with Sofia wrapped in a blanket. The girl was traumatized but physically unharmed, and Vincent was being surprisingly gentle as he guided her to a waiting vehicle. Dmitry Volkov, Vincent said. The uncle, the one actually in charge. Marco's conversation was brief and conducted in fluent Russian, something Alessandra hadn't known he could speak. When he ended the call, his expression was carved from stone. Dimitri's agreed to meet, tonight, neutral ground. Marco holstered his weapon. He knows this has gone too far, knows if we go to full war, both organizations will be destroyed. He's going to negotiate. Alessandra was skeptical. After this? He's going to hear our terms. Whether he accepts them or not determines what happens next. Marco turned to her. And you're coming with me. Marco, you were right earlier. This started because of strategy you developed. It ends with you there to finish it. He paused. Besides, Dmitri needs to see you, needs to understand that you're not some helpless target he can use as leverage. You're my partner. Attacking you means attacking me, and I don't negotiate with people who attack me. I eliminate them. The meeting was set for 2 hours later at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. Neutral ground, public enough that neither side would risk a massacre, private enough for honest conversation. Alessandra changed clothes at the estate, washing away the night's violence and armor herself in a simple black suit that suggested business rather than vulnerability. When she came downstairs, she found Marco waiting, similarly dressed, looking every inch the dangerous man he was. Ready? He asked. As I'll ever be. They drove to the diner with heavy security, 2 SUVs full of armed men, though they'd stay outside during the actual meeting. When they walked in, Alessandra saw that Dmitry Volkov had done the same. The restaurant had been cleared of other patrons, just the staff nervously serving coffee, while 2 of Chicago's most dangerous organizations faced off across a vinyl booth. Dmitry Volkov was in his mid-50s, gray-haired and barrel-chested, with eyes that had seen too much violence to ever be surprised by it. He studied Alessandra with frank interest as they approached. Mrs. DeLuca, he said in heavily accented English, you have caused my organization considerable trouble. Your organization tried to have me kidnapped, Alessandra replied evenly, sliding into the booth across from him while Marco sat beside her. I'd say we're even. Dimitri's smile was cold, direct. I appreciate this. Your husband, he is known for many things, but directness is not usually among them. My husband is sitting right here, Marco said quietly, and he's growing impatient. You called this meeting, Dmitri. State your terms. Terms? Dmitri laughed, but there was no humor in it. You destroy my nephew's operation, humiliate my family twice, cost us millions in lost territory and resources, and you think I'm here to offer terms? You're here because you're smart enough to know that full war would destroy both our organizations, Alessandra cut in. The Kozlovs learned that lesson. The question is whether you're smart enough to learn from their mistake. Dimitri's expression hardened. You're very bold for someone who was almost taken tonight. Almost doesn't count, she said calmly. Your men failed, just like they failed with Sofia Russo, just like they failed at every escalation you've attempted. She leaned forward. Mr. Volkov, let's be honest about what's happening here. Your family came to Chicago thinking you could carve out territory through intimidation and violence. But you underestimated the existing power structure. You thought the families would fracture under pressure, that old rivalries would prevent unified response. You were wrong. And now? Dmitri asked. Now you have a choice, Marco said. You can continue this war, watch your organization bleed resources and men until there's nothing left, and eventually be eliminated by forces that outnumber and outmaneuver you at every turn. Or you can accept a negotiated withdrawal, Alessandra finished. You leave Chicago, take your remaining operations, your people, whatever you can salvage. Relocate to another city where you won't face united opposition. You'll lose what you've built here, but you'll survive to build elsewhere. Dmitri was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And if I refuse? Then we stop being surgical, Marco said flatly. We stop targeting your operations and start targeting your people. Every Volkov, every associate, every person connected to your organization. We'll use every resource at our disposal, legal, illegal, and everything in between, to erase you from existence. Not just in Chicago, everywhere. That is quite a threat. It's not a threat, Alessandra said. It's a promise. You made this personal when you tried to use me as leverage, when you took an innocent girl to draw us into conflict. Personal means we don't stop until the job is finished. She saw the moment Dmitri understood, saw him recognize that they weren't bluffing, that the calm delivery made the promise more credible rather than less. He'd gambled on the DeLuca organization being weakened by Marco's marriage, by perceived vulnerability. Instead, he'd unified them, given them common cause, and now faced an opponent with nothing to lose and everything to protect. How long do I have? Dmitri asked finally. 72 hours to begin withdrawal, Marco said. 2 weeks to complete it. You can take your portable assets, but Chicago territory stays with the families. And if some of my people wish to stay, they're welcome to stay, Alessandra said. As individuals starting over, with no connection to Volkov operations, we're not interested in punishing people who had no choice in your decisions, but anyone who maintains organizational ties gets treated as a continued threat. Dmitri studied them both, and Alessandra could see him calculating, weighing pride against pragmatism, ego against survival. Finally, he nodded slowly. You have terms I can work with. I will speak with my people. You have 48 hours to give us a final answer, Marco said. After that, the offer expires and we move to total elimination. They stood to leave, but Dmitri's voice stopped them. DeLuca, a word? Marco tensed but nodded to Alessandra to wait near the door. She moved away, though not so far she couldn't hear. You have chosen well with this woman, Dmitri said quietly. I thought marriage would weaken you. Instead, you have become more dangerous. This is unexpected. Then you understand why attacking her was your biggest mistake, Marco replied. I do. Dmitri paused. For what it is worth, the attempt on her tonight was not authorized by me. My nephew Alexei, he acted without consultation. He will be disciplined for this. Must see that he is, Marco's voice was ice. Because if he makes another attempt, I won't wait for your answer. I'll burn your organization to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. When they returned to the estate hours later, Alessandra was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the night's violence and its aftermath. But there was also relief, the bone-deep knowledge that they'd accomplished what they'd set out to do. Sophia was safe, returned to her grateful father. The Volkov threat was being neutralized through negotiation rather than bloodshed, and she'd proven, both to Marco and to herself, that she could handle the darker realities of this world. Marco walked her to their room. Not separate rooms anymore, she noticed. Somewhere in the past weeks, they'd quietly merged their lives completely. You were extraordinary tonight, he said as they undressed for bed. The way you handled Dmitri, the way you articulated our position, it was perfect. I was terrified the entire time, Alessandra admitted. I know, so was I. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. When I saw those men trying to breach the SUV, when I realized you were under attack and I wasn't there to protect you. His voice cracked. I've never been that scared. Not when my father died, not when the Kozlovs tried to kill me. Nothing comes close to the terror of almost losing you. She tilted her head up to look at him. But you didn't lose me. No. His hand came up to cup her face. And I'm never letting you go. I know I told you once that caring made me weak, but I was wrong. You make me stronger, Alessandra, braver, better than I ever could have been alone. Marco. He kissed her, deep and desperate, pouring all the fear and relief and love he couldn't quite articulate into the connection between them. Alessandra kissed him back with equal intensity, letting herself feel everything she'd been holding at bay, the terror of almost being taken, the fierce pride in what they'd accomplished, the overwhelming gratitude that they'd both survived. They made love that night with an urgency born of how close they'd come to losing each other. And afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head on his chest, Alessandra finally let herself believe that maybe this could work, that maybe two damaged people could build something whole together. I love you, Marco whispered into her hair. I should have said it before, should have said it weeks ago, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Alessandra, completely, terrifyingly, with everything I am. Tears pricked her eyes. I love you too, even though you're difficult and emotionally unavailable and sometimes make decisions that drive me insane. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. That's the most romantic declaration I've ever heard. I'm not romantic, I'm practical. But she was smiling as she said it. And practically speaking, we're stuck with each other, so we might as well make the best of it. The best of it, Marco agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. For the rest of our lives. But even as she drifted off to sleep, secure in his arms and in the life they were building together, Alessandra had no idea that their greatest test was still to come. That the real enemy had been watching from the shadows all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of everything they'd built. And that moment was approaching faster than either of them could have imagined. The betrayal came from the last place Alessandra expected. 3 days after the Volkov meeting, when Dmitri had formally agreed to withdraw and the threat seemed neutralized, she was reviewing financial reports in Marco's study when Vincent entered without knocking. His face was ashen, his usual composure completely shattered. "We have a problem," he said, his voice shaking. "A serious one." Marco looked up from his laptop. "The Volkovs changed their minds?" "No, it's not the Volkovs." Vincent set a tablet on the desk, his hands trembling. "It's worse. Much worse." The screen showed financial transactions, massive ones, flowing out of DeLuca accounts into offshore holdings. Millions of dollars moved over the past 6 months, all authorized by codes that only a handful of people had access to. "Someone's been embezzling," Alessandra said, her mind already working through the implications. "Who has these access codes?" "Me, Marco. His accountant Michael Chen, and—" Vincent's voice broke. "And my uncle Antonio." The name hung in the air like poison. Antonio Greco, Vincent's uncle, the man who'd resented Vincent's choice to work for Marco instead of building the Greco family organization. The man they'd identified as sympathetic to the Volkovs but had written off as a minor concern. "How much?" Marco's voice was deadly quiet. 17 million so far, but that's not the worst part. Vincent pulled up another screen. "He's been feeding intelligence to our competitors for months. The Benedettis knew about our shipping contracts before we finalized them. The Torres family knew our security rotations. And the Volkovs—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. "The Volkovs knew exactly when and where to grab Sofia Russo, because Antonio told them." Alessandra felt ice flood through her veins. "He orchestrated the kidnapping?" "Not directly, but he provided the intelligence that made it possible." Vincent's expression was murderous. "He's been playing all sides, taking money from everyone, trying to destabilize Marco's leadership so the council would turn to someone else, someone he could control." "Where is he now?" Marco was already standing, his hand moving to the weapon he always carried. "That's the problem. He's disappeared. Went dark about 6 hours ago, right after transferring the last batch of funds." Vincent pulled up security footage. But before he went underground, he sent a message to the family council, calling for an emergency meeting tonight to discuss your leadership, Marco. He's claiming you've become compromised, that marrying Alessandra has made you weak and vulnerable. "He's making his move," Alessandra said quietly. "The embezzlement, the intelligence leaks. He's been building a case to take over the organization." Marco's laugh was bitter. "He thinks the council will back him over me?" "He's been cultivating support for months," Vincent said. "Small favors, strategic information, positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to your increasingly erratic leadership." He paused. "And he has evidence to support his claims. The Volkov situation, the risks you took for Alessandra, the way you've changed your operating procedures, he's spinning all of it as weakness." "How many council members has he turned?" Alessandra asked. "At least 3 out of 7 that we know of. Maybe more." Vincent's hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry. I should have seen this coming. He's family, and You trusted him," Marco said. "That's not a weakness, Vincent. It's human." He turned to Alessandra. "The council meeting is in 4 hours. If Antonio has the votes, he can force me out. Strip my authority, divide my assets, possibly even order my execution if he frames me as a threat to organizational stability." "Then we need to turn the council before he can make his case," Alessandra said, her mind already racing through options. "Who are the 4 members we can count on?" Vincent listed them, loyal soldiers who'd worked with Marco for years, who'd profited from his leadership and had no reason to want him gone. But 4 out of 7 wasn't enough. They needed at least one more vote to maintain control. Carlo Russo? Alessandra said suddenly. His daughter was taken because of Antonio's intelligence leak. If we can prove that connection, he'd vote against Antonio in a heartbeat, Marco finished. But proving it in 4 hours? The financial records, Alessandra was already pulling up screens on the tablet. Antonio took payments from the Volkovs around the same time as Sofia's kidnapping. If we can trace those payments back to their source, show the timeline correlation. It's circumstantial, Vincent warned. It's enough to create reasonable doubt. She looked at Marco. And doubt is all we need. If Carlo abstains instead of voting for Antonio, we maintain your position. Marco studied her for a long moment, and she saw something fierce and proud in his expression. You're doing it again, seeing the strategic angle everyone else misses. I'm trying to save your life, Alessandra corrected. Now help me trace these transactions before Antonio has time to destroy the evidence. The next 3 hours were a blur of financial forensics, phone calls, and increasingly desperate attempts to build an airtight case. Alessandra coordinated with Marco's financial team, tracking payment flows through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Vincent worked his contacts in the Russian community, gathering testimony about Antonio's communications with Volkov representatives. Marco reached out to the loyal council members, preparing them for what was coming. By the time they had to leave for the meeting, they had enough evidence to make a case, but whether it would be enough to convince the council was anyone's guess. The meeting was held at a private club in downtown Chicago, neutral ground where the 7 council members could gather without fear of surveillance or interference. Alessandra wasn't technically allowed to attend. Council meetings were for made members only, but Marco had insisted she wait in an adjacent room, close enough to consult if needed. She watched through a one-way mirror as the 7 men assembled around an antique conference table. Antonio Greco sat at one end, looking confident and composed, every inch the reasonable alternative to Marco's supposedly compromised leadership. He'd aged well, his silver hair lending him an air of distinguished authority that would play well with the older council members. Marco entered last, flanked by Vincent, and Alessandra saw several council members shift uncomfortably. They knew what was coming, a battle for control of the organization, with their votes determining the outcome. Gentlemen, Antonio began, his voice smooth, thank you for gathering on such short notice. I've called this meeting because I believe we face a crisis of leadership that threatens everything we've built. That's a serious accusation, Antonio, said Marcus De Laurentiis, one of the old guard who'd worked with Marco's father. You'd better have evidence to support it. I have more than evidence. I have a pattern. Antonio pulled out a folder, thick with documents. Over the past 6 months, Marco has made increasingly reckless decisions. He married a woman from a family we'd already rejected as unsuitable, elevating her to a position of influence she's not qualified to hold. He's taken unnecessary risks to protect her, including the operation that nearly cost us the Sofia Russo situation. The operation that saved Sofia Russo, Marco interrupted coldly. Let's be precise about what actually happened, Antonio. Saved her from a situation you helped create, Antonio shot back. Your marriage to Alessandra Romano destabilized our alliance structure, created vulnerabilities that our enemies exploited. If you'd maintained the professional distance expected of a leader instead of acting like a lovesick fool, careful, Marco's voice was lethal. You're about to say something you can't take back. Antonio smiled. Truth can't be taken back. It can only be acknowledged. He turned to the council. I'm not here to attack Marco personally. I'm here because I care about this organization's survival. And right now, our survival is threatened by leadership that prioritizes personal feelings over strategic necessity. You're saying Marco should divorce his wife? Carlo Russo's voice was sharp. On what grounds? I'm saying a leader who can't separate personal loyalty from organizational interest is a liability. Antonio pulled out more documents. I have evidence of $17 million in questionable transactions, security protocols that were modified to accommodate Mrs. DeLuca's safety at the expense of organizational security, strategic decisions that benefited the Romano family at our expense. You're twisting facts, Vincent said, his voice tight with fury. Those transactions were legitimate. Were they? Antonio's expression was almost pitying. Vincent, I know you're loyal to Marco. But loyalty doesn't require blindness. Look at the evidence objectively. Alessandra watched the council members' faces, saw doubt creeping in. Antonio was good. He'd constructed a narrative that sounded reasonable, that played on fears about emotional compromise and reckless leadership. And the council members, pragmatic men who'd survived by trusting their instincts, were listening. Marco needed to strike back, now. She pulled out her phone, texting him the signal they'd arranged. 30 seconds later, Marco's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked directly at Antonio. "You're right about one thing," Marco said calmly. "We do have a crisis of leadership, but it's not the leadership you're describing." He pulled out his own folder, setting it on the table with deliberate precision. "For the past 6 months, someone has been embezzling from our organization. $17 million, just as Antonio mentioned. Interesting that he knew the exact figure before I presented it. That same someone has been selling intelligence to our competitors, compromising our operations, and actively working to destabilize my leadership so they could step into the void." The room went silent. Every eye was on Marco now. "That someone," Marco continued, "is sitting at this table. Antonio Greco has been systematically betraying this organization while positioning himself as its savior." Antonio's laugh was genuinely amused. "You're accusing me? Your wife's paranoia has clearly infected your judgment, Marco. I've dedicated 30 years to this organization and spent the last 6 months trying to tear it down." Marco slid documents across the table. "Financial records showing transfers from DeLuca accounts to offshore holdings you control. Communications between you and Volkov representatives, including the intelligence that led to Sofia Russo's kidnapping." Carlo Russo shot to his feet. "You told the Volkovs about my daughter?" "I told them nothing," Antonio said quickly. "These documents are fabricated. They're from your own encrypted accounts," Vincent cut in. "Accounts you thought were secure. We traced every transaction, every communication. You've been playing all sides, Uncle. Taking money from the Volkovs, the Benedettis, the Torres family, anyone willing to pay for information about Marco's operations." The council members were passing documents between them now, their expressions darkening as they reviewed the evidence. Alessandra saw the moment the tide turned. When Carlo Russo looked at the timeline showing Antonio's communications with the Volkovs just days before Sofia's kidnapping. "You almost got my daughter killed," Carlo said, his voice shaking with rage. "For what? Money? Power?" "For this organization's future," Antonio said, and for the first time his composure cracked. "Marco has become a liability. His marriage has compromised his judgment, made him vulnerable in ways that will destroy us all. I did what was necessary to force a change before it was too late." "You betrayed us," Marcus De Laurentiis said flatly. "You sold our intelligence to our enemies, endangered our families, and embezzled millions, all while claiming to protect the organization." "I was protecting it from him." Antonio pointed at Marco, his control completely gone now. "He's weak. He loves that woman, and love is death in our world. I watched his father die for love, watched this organization nearly collapse because Dominic DeLuca couldn't separate his heart from his head. I won't watch it happen again." The admission hung in the air, devastating in its honesty. Antonio believed every word he was saying, genuinely thought he was saving the organization from the weakness of caring. And in that moment, Alessandra understood. Antonio wasn't evil. He was terrified. Terrified that history would repeat itself, that Marco would make his father's mistakes, that love would destroy everything they'd built. He was wrong, but he believed it absolutely. "You're right about one thing," Marco said quietly. "My father died for love. He walked into a trap to save my mother, knowing he probably wouldn't survive. And for years, I thought that made him weak. Thought emotion was a liability that had to be suppressed at all costs." He paused. "But I was wrong. My father died because he had something worth dying for, something that gave his life meaning beyond power and control. And that's not weakness, Antonio. That's strength you can't comprehend because you've never let yourself feel it." He stood, moving to where he could see Alessandra through the one-way mirror. "I love my wife. That doesn't compromise my judgment. It sharpens it. Because now I have something to protect beyond my own interests. Now I have a partner who makes me smarter, braver, better than I could ever be alone. And if you think that makes me weak, you fundamentally misunderstood what strength actually means." The council members were silent, watching the confrontation unfold. The question before this council is simple, Marco continued. Do you believe that caring about someone makes a leader vulnerable? Or do you believe that a leader who has something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth dying for, that leader is stronger than one who has nothing? He turned back to face them. I've made mistakes. I rejected Alessandra publicly because I was afraid, and I've spent months trying to prove I'm worthy of a second chance. But I won't apologize for loving her, won't apologize for building a partnership that makes this organization stronger. If you want to remove me for that, take your vote. But know that you're choosing fear over courage, isolation over connection, and the same hollow existence that almost destroyed my father. Carlo Russo spoke first. I vote to maintain Marco's leadership and to expel Antonio Greco from this organization for treason. Marcus De Laurentiis nodded. Seconded. Antonio, you've betrayed everything we stand for. The other loyal members added their voices, one by one. Even the council members Antonio had been courting looked uncomfortable now, unwilling to support someone who'd been caught red-handed in betrayal. Antonio's face went white as he realized he'd lost. You're making a mistake. When his love for that woman gets him killed, when you're all paying the price for his weakness, get out, Marco said quietly. You have 24 hours to liquidate your holdings and leave Chicago. If you're still here after that, I'll consider you an active threat and respond accordingly. Vincent moved to escort his uncle from the room, his expression a mixture of anger and grief. Antonio went without further protest, but the look he gave Marco was pure poison, a promise that this wasn't over, that somehow, someday, he'd prove he was right. When the room cleared, Marco came to find Alessandra. She was standing by the mirror, tears streaming down her face. You heard? He asked. Every word. She threw her arms around him. You defended me, defended us, in front of everyone. I meant every word, he said fiercely. I love you, Alessandra, and I'm done apologizing for it, done pretending it makes me weak. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and anyone who can't see that isn't someone whose opinion I value. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the aftermath of the confrontation. Finally, Alessandra pulled back to look at him. What happens now? Now we rebuild, solidify the council's support, repair the damage Antonio caused, and make sure everyone understands that the DeLuca organization is stronger than ever. He paused. And we live our lives, together, without fear dictating our choices. But even as she nodded, Alessandra knew there was still one more thing they needed to address. Antonio might have been expelled, but his warnings about vulnerability hadn't been entirely wrong. Loving someone in their world did create risk. The question was whether they could find a way to protect each other while still maintaining the connection that made them stronger. The answer came 3 months later, in the form of an opportunity Alessandra had been developing quietly on her own. She'd been using her position as Marco's wife to build connections outside the traditional underworld power structure. Legitimate business contacts, political allies, even law enforcement relationships through Agent Chen. And she'd realized something crucial. The organizations that survived longest weren't the ones that relied purely on intimidation and violence. They were the ones that evolved, that found ways to transition from purely criminal enterprises into legitimate business operations. I want to start a foundation, she told Marco one evening over dinner. A legitimate nonprofit that helps women escape abusive situations, provides job training and housing assistance, helps them build independent lives. Marco set down his fork. You want to go legitimate? I want to give us options, she corrected. Your father died because enemies could target your mother to hurt him. But what if we built something outside the traditional structure? Something that couldn't be attacked the same way because it operated in the light instead of the shadows? He studied her thoughtfully. You're talking about transitioning the organization. Eventually, yes. Not overnight. That would be impossible. But gradually, over years, moving resources into legitimate operations while maintaining enough street presence to protect ourselves. She leaned forward. Marco, we could be the family that breaks the cycle, that builds something sustainable, instead of just passing violence down to the next generation. You're thinking about children, he said quietly. I'm thinking about the future, whatever that holds. She paused. But yes, if we have children someday, I'd like them to inherit something better than constant fear of assassination. Marco was silent for a long time, and she saw him wrestling with the idea. His entire identity was built on being a crime lord, on wielding power through fear and force. What she was suggesting meant fundamentally reimagining who he was. It would take years, he said finally. Decades, maybe. And there's no guarantee we'd succeed. No guarantee, Alessandra agreed, but a chance, a real chance to build something that lasts beyond us. He reached across the table, taking her hand. If we do this, we do it together. As partners. You lead the foundation, make the connections, build the legitimate structure. I'll handle the transition on the organizational side, slowly shifting resources and power. Deal? Deal. The foundation launched 6 months later, the Romano De Luca Foundation for Women's Independence. It was funded by anonymous donations that everyone suspected came from organized crime money being laundered into legitimate use. But the work it did was real. Within a year, they'd helped 200 women escape abusive situations, had established 3 housing facilities, and were partnering with businesses to provide job placement services. Alessandra ran it herself, dedicating the same strategic brilliance she'd brought to underworld negotiations to actually helping people. And Marco supported her completely, using his influence to protect the foundation's operations while quietly beginning the slow process of transitioning De Luca resources into legal enterprises. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, threats from rivals who saw the legitimization as weakness, internal resistance from soldiers who didn't understand why they were going soft. But Marco and Alessandra held firm, supporting each other through every challenge, building something new from the ruins of what they'd both been raised to accept as inevitable. 2 years after the foundation launched, Alessandra discovered she was pregnant. She told Marco on a quiet Sunday morning, just the two of them in the bedroom they now shared without question. He'd been reading financial reports, and she'd been reviewing foundation grant applications. And the domesticity of it all struck her as almost surreal compared to where they'd started. "Marco," she said quietly, "I'm pregnant." He looked up from his reports, and she saw the moment the words registered, saw shock, then joy, then fear flash across his face in rapid succession. How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully. "Terrified," she admitted, "but happy, excited, all of it at once." She moved to sit beside him. "This is what we've been building toward, isn't it? A future where our children don't have to choose between family and morality, where they can build legitimate lives." Marco set aside his reports and pulled her close. "I'm going to be a terrible father. I have no idea how to do this. You'll figure it out. We both will." She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "This is our chance to break the cycle completely. To raise someone who knows both sides of us, the strength and the strategy, but also the love and the hope." "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A wife I love, a child on the way, a legitimate business I can be proud of. For years I thought happiness was weakness, that the only thing that mattered was power. And now? Now I know that power without purpose is empty. And you gave me purpose, Alessandra. You and this life we're building together." Their daughter was born on a cold February morning, 7 months later. They named her Sophia, not after Sophia Russo, but after Marco's mother, the woman whose death had set him on the path of emotional isolation that had taken decades to break through. Holding his daughter for the first time, Marco wept. Alessandra watched from her hospital bed, exhausted and overwhelmed, and more in love with her complicated husband than she'd ever thought possible. "She's perfect," Marco whispered, his voice raw. "Absolutely perfect." "She is," Alessandra agreed, "and she's going to grow up knowing she's loved, knowing her father chose connection over isolation. That's your legacy, Marco, not the empire, not the power. This." The years that followed were challenging but rewarding. The foundation grew, expanding to 6 cities and helping thousands of women build independent lives. The De Luca organization gradually transitioned, with Marco carefully moving resources into shipping companies, real estate development, technology investments, legitimate businesses that generated real profit without requiring violence or intimidation. There were still threats, still moments when the old world reached out to drag them back, but Marco and Alessandra faced them together, as partners, using both the ruthless strategic thinking they'd honed in the underworld and the legitimate connections they'd built in the light. Antonio Greco disappeared after his expulsion, and they heard nothing from him for 3 years. Then one day a letter arrived, postmarked from somewhere in South America, addressed to Marco. Alessandra watched as her husband read it, saw his expression cycle through anger, confusion, and finally something almost like pity. "What does he say?" she asked. "That he was wrong." Marco handed her the letter. "That watching from a distance, seeing what we built, he finally understands that love isn't weakness, that he spent his whole life running from connection and died alone because of it." The letter was brief, written in shaking handwriting that suggested Antonio's health was failing. In it, he apologized for his betrayal, acknowledged that his fear had made him cruel, and asked only that they remember him as someone who'd been trying to protect something he loved, even if his methods were wrong. "Do you forgive him?" Alessandra asked. Marco was quiet for a long moment. "I understand him. That's not the same as forgiveness, but it's something. He was right that love can make you vulnerable. He just never understood that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open yourself up to being hurt." "Like you did with me," she said softly. "Like we both did." He pulled her close. "And look what it gave us. A real marriage, a daughter, a future worth building. I'd take that over invulnerable isolation any day." When Sophia was 5 years old, she asked her father what he did for work. They were in the garden of their Lake Forest estate, still the same property where Marco had proposed his desperate second marriage, but transformed now by Alessandra's influence. Flowers grew where there'd once been only perfect grass. A swing set stood in what had been a formal sculpture garden. The cold museum had become a home. "I help people," Marco told his daughter, honestly. "Sometimes it's complicated and sometimes I have to make difficult choices. But everything I do to protect our family and help people build better lives." "Like Mama's foundation?" Sophia asked. "Like that, yes. Your mother is smarter than I am. She figured out how to help people directly. I'm still learning." Alessandra watched from the porch, her hand resting on her rounded belly. They were expecting their second child, a son, if the ultrasound was right. Marco wanted to name him Dominic after his father, and Alessandra had agreed. The Romano family had reconciled with them over the years, her father grudgingly admitting that Marco had proven himself worthy of his daughter. Her brothers worked in the foundation now, helping manage the growing operation. Her mother doted on Sophia and spoke constantly about the grandchildren to come. It wasn't perfect. They still navigated threats, still dealt with rivals who thought legitimization was weakness. But Marco's reputation was enough to keep most challenges at bay, and the ones that did emerge were handled with the same ruthless efficiency he'd always possessed, just directed toward protection rather than conquest. On Sophia's 6th birthday, Alessandra and Marco stood together watching their daughter blow out candles, surrounded by family and friends from both their old world and the new one they were building. It was surreal seeing the families who'd once defined themselves through violence gathering peacefully to celebrate a child's birthday. "Do you ever regret it?" Alessandra asked quietly. "Giving up the absolute power you once had?" Marco considered the question seriously. "I gave up absolute power over other people, but I gained something more valuable: agency over my own life. The ability to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over cynicism." He turned to look at her. "You taught me that. On the day I rejected you at that altar, I made the biggest mistake of my life. But you gave me a second chance, and I've spent every day since trying to prove I deserved it." "You proved it," Alessandra said, her eyes filling with tears. "Years ago. The moment you chose to be vulnerable instead of invulnerable, to risk loving me even though it scared you, that's when you proved it." He kissed her, gentle and sweet, with their daughter giggling nearby and their son growing inside her and the future they'd built together stretching out before them. Years later, when Sophia was grown and running the foundation herself, when their son Dominic was graduating from business school with plans to expand their legitimate operations globally, when Marco and Alessandra were in their 60s and looking back on lives that had exceeded every expectation, that's when the full weight of what they'd accomplished became clear. They'd broken the cycle, had transformed an organization built on violence into one that created opportunity, had raised children who knew how to be strong without being cruel, who understood power as responsibility rather than dominance. And it had all started with a rejection at an altar with a woman brave enough to demand better, and a man finally courageous enough to give it. "We did it," Alessandra said one evening, sitting with Marco on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the lake. "We actually did it." "We did," Marco agreed, taking her hand. "Together." "Always together," she confirmed. "That was the promise, wasn't it? From that second wedding, when we both chose each other despite every reason not to." "Best decision I ever made," Marco said. "Rejecting you the first time was the worst. Marrying you the second time was the best. Everything good in my life flows from that choice." Alessandra leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the safety of decades of partnership, the contentment of a life well lived. They'd faced every challenge their world could throw at them: betrayal, violence, political machinations, the constant pressure to revert to old patterns. And they'd survived it all. More than survived, they'd thrived, had built something that would outlast them both. "I love you," she said quietly. "I never get tired of saying it." "I love you too," Marco replied, "and I never get tired of hearing it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together in the home they'd built, surrounded by the life they'd created, grateful for every moment that had led them here, from public rejection to private partnership, from fear to love, from hollow power to meaningful purpose. It had been the hardest journey either of them had ever undertaken, and neither would have changed a single moment of it, because some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth building a whole new world for. And love, real, vulnerable, transformative love, was at the top of that list. Always.